I want to welcome all of you to this afternoon's program. It's a very special program. We have our exhibit in our park this afternoon. I do have to send you regrets and regards from Judy Flagg, the town historian. She was suddenly taken ill, so she could not be here today. But I want to give you a little preliminary information about our speaker today. Stephen Haggerty, the author of the Norman Rockwell Models, in and out of the studio, is going to give us a PowerPoint presentation today. Rockwell was a longtime resident of West Arlington, Vermont, and called upon his neighbors. Many of the neighbors, relatives, and descendants are here today. We're very happy that they were able to make this really exciting program. I'm sure many of you, as I remember from a child, reading the Saturday Evening Post, at least I could read the cover and the cartoons, maybe not all the narrative that was there, but it was always an exciting magazine, and I was always interested in looking at the covers on the cartoon. The one that particularly interested me was the one about the boys playing baseball, because I loved baseball. But Haggerty's book served as a catalyst for Judy Flagg, the town historian, and Tom McMorris, who was our photographer. Judy and Tom did extensive research to get the display set up, and we will learn a whole lot more today about the models that were used when Steve talks about them. Following the presentation, there will be more books sold downstairs. The exhibit will be open for those of you who arrived later today. So, without further ado, I do want to point out that, and I think they're all here, but some of the models from our area, which again Steve will talk about, Paul Adams and Pauline Adams Grimes, Bob Buck and relatives of Bob Buck are here. Alvin Robertson and Al Prindle, we have photographs of them and covers of them. Ken and Charlotte Gautry, Ruth McClanahan, Skelly and relatives are here. And if I have missed anybody, I apologize. But I think we're fortunate in that our area, Rupert and Shushan area, have had such a wonderful time posing for Norman Rockwell. So without further ado, here's Steve Haggerty and his PowerPoint program.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, well, thanks for everybody for coming. I think most of us know Norman Rockwell's paintings, but I'll review a little bit. Over his career, a 50-year career of painting illustrations, he did over 4,000 of them. Amazing. And one thing I like about his paintings, when you look at them, you're not quite sure what he's talking about. And then you look around for a few clues and you smile and say, I got it. And so I want to start out with okay, very good. Sorry about the little glitch. Okay, so a lot of people around the country don't realize that Norman Rockwell used real people in the paintings. And just who were these people? I'll get back to this in a minute. Okay, so I start just telling a little bit about myself and my connection to the Rockwell models. So I'm from Connecticut, but when I was a kid, we spent 3 months a year in Sandgate. My father was a freelance musician, so nobody throw anything at me because, you know, I'm partially from Sandgate. But anyway, that's our house. I don't know if anybody knew any of the Smith family. Miller Smith, his family owned that from the 1750s up until the 1950s. His brothers were Harley and Edison, and so I worked for Millard Smith, and that's our barn in Sandgate. It's almost on the Salem border, and Millard Smith, part of his farm was in Salem. And that was an active dairy farm into the 50s. And you see it has those gnarly locust trees that are common, that make it sort of enchanting at night. Now, again, I don't know if anybody knew Richard Schroll from Salem. Richard was a farmhand for Millard Smith. The reason I mention that is because both Rich and my brothers and I, after Millard went out of business, we went down and worked in West Arlington for Charlie Bentley, Junior Bentley. And I'm in the blue here. I put my first bale of hay on a wagon when I was 8. I got it halfway up and used all my might to push it up and impress my 3 older brothers, because little kids who have older brothers aren't going to be beaten on a farm, you know? And, okay, so here's Norman Rockwell in West Arlington, and that's his cook and housekeeper, Marie Briggs. She had a business after Norman left, in Arlington, Marie's Baked Goods, so at the Wayside Country Store, if anybody knows it, or the IGA, Salter's IGA. And then Marie, after Norman left, she was the cook and housekeeper for Floyd and Charlie Bentley, who I worked for. So Marie was a town saint, you could call her. And then the way I got involved in the book was a model named Don Tracty Jr., who's from Sandgate, West Arlington, now lives in Bennington. He read my book, Cows in the Fog, that I do have that downstairs too. And he thought it was authentic Vermont, you know, not like a guy from the Bronx. Sorry, coming up and writing a book about the models. He's got this guy who's actually from West Arlington and Sandgate, me, who was a journalist. So I was privileged to get the encouragement and a list of all the models in that area, and also, you know, Salem and Cambridge. Yeah, Norman did a lot in this area too. And that's my book, published by Roman and Littlefield. And this week, I just feel really grateful to find my book in USA Today. So that was a real nice thing. My audio book, which is in CD or downloadable, is read by Grover Gardner. I got fortunate again. Grover works for Blackstone Publishing. He was named the top narrator of the year by Publishers Weekly, and he loves Rockwell and art history. And so he read the book for that CD and download. Won't have too many commercials, don't worry. And I had that up already. If anybody wants to get on Facebook, I do communicate with a lot of people, and it's fun swapping stories about Salem, Cambridge, Arlington. Okay, so Norman Rockwell did his first paintings in New Rochelle, New York. I happen to work there now, coincidentally. That's where our office is. And I met a man, a couple years ago. He was 92, and he said, I remember seeing Norman Rockwell here in New Rochelle. And that was pretty neat. So that's Norman and his wife, Mary, just after they got married. And these pictures were given to me by Jarvis Rockwell out of Norman's home photo album. So some of these, the Rockwell agency said, nobody's ever seen before I got them. So I feel good about that. That was very nice of them. So, of course, there we have Norman, easily recognizable. His son, Thomas, who's 90 years old now. Mary, his wife. And Nancy Rockwell, who moved up to, I think, the Bennington area back when Norman moved to Vermont. And this is young Jarvis Rockwell, who's instrumental in me writing the book. Jarvis is 91 years young, and he's full of life and full of laughter, so it's been a privilege to have him help me with the book. Just thought this one was a nice one of Norman and Mary from the photo album on the water. They lived in, as I said, New Rochelle, New York is on the ocean. And they're, looking very content there, out on the water. Okay, so now we're in West Arlington, Vermont. This is, in 1938, Norman and Mary bought this house. And they moved there permanently in 1940. They didn't plan to move there permanently, but they really liked it. And Norman said, I see amazing faces out here to paint. Living in New Rochelle, it was all like business people and marketing people who, knew how to put poker faces on. Whatever not responsive like the country people are. That's what he said, that people had great expressions around here. And there's his first studio, which burned down in 1943. He believed that he dropped some hot ashes on a cushion by his window seat, and that those ignited the cushion and burned down the studio. This is a view from that house. These are all from the Rockwell photo album in the early 40s. And there was his studio that he just had renovated by a guy named Walt Squares in West Arlington, who was a builder there. And that's a front view of the house, and Norman's Woody station wagon that one of the models I'll talk about remembered very well when it came up the driveway. Again, from the Rockwell Home album, this is, of course, Norman right there, wearing a bow tie, and one of his models, his favorite Boy Scout model, Buddy Edgerton, said, when Norman got dressed up and put on a bow tie, he looked pretty dapper. And so there's Mary again. I'm guessing that's Mary's sister. That's the one I don't know. Mrs. Rockwell again. This is right in West Arlington. And Norman's mother-in-law and father-in-law. And here's young Thomas Rockwell and Jarvis Rockwell, who we'll see a few times here, and Peter Rockwell, who was a sculptor at the Norman Rockwell Museum. His sculptures are featured on the outside of the museum in the yard. Okay, well, somebody told me that Norman never swam in the Battenkill. So I beg to differ, because there he is, sitting in the Battenkill, and as most of us or all of us know, it's cold water, especially where it's low like that and moving fast. And here's young Tom Rockwell again, having fun with his dad, and young Jarvis. So in front of that house was the Battenkill River. And this is Norman's house today in West Arlington. It was built in 1792. He was lonely at the other house. Well, his wife was too, and the kids. The nearest house there was a half a mile away, so it's a beautiful site. The house is still there, looks pretty much the same. But, it got a little lonely. So they moved to this 1792 Colonial, and there's Norman's studio in the backyard. You can go visit it, actually. The owner, Kevin Harder, he allows people to visit. It's a bed and breakfast called Rockwell's Retreat. And this is the studio, that same studio in probably 1945. It looks identical, really, today. And there's Norman at the easel, of course, painting away. That's in his West Arlington studio. And you see Norman here. Now, if you can see the jacket, it's tattered there, and he's got paint all over his pants. And Jarvis said, I hated when Dad wore that jacket and those pants around. Jarvis was an embarrassed teenager. and he wished he had gotten a new jacket to wear around, but Norman prided himself on being very humble. Whenever he could, he used self-deprecating humor and said, well, I got a few good paintings, but a lot of them aren't that good. And so I think that's how he kept going for 60 years. He didn't let it swell his head, but he did love fan letters and such things. Now there's Mary Rockwell again. There's one of the stars of paintings. The star of a painting called Going and Coming. There's Springer Spaniel Butch. Now this fellow, when Jarvis Rockwell was in the Korean War, he brought this fellow home from Korea, and he became a U.S. citizen. And he's actually in one of the paintings that you'll see here. And that's young Peter Rockwell, who became a sculptor. And I don't know if I should say this or not, but he told me he had a little argument with his father because his father said, Peter, whatever you do, don't become a sculptor. And he said, you won't make any money. So maybe 50 or 60 years later, I asked Peter, did you make money? And he said, no. So I think Peter would enjoy that if he were still around. So. Okay, now, many of you know the West Arlington Green. There's our 1802 church. I've been to services there. And the dance hall, and the red-covered bridge. Now at the dance hall, Norman only had to walk a short distance. There's his front step, the stoop, over to the dance hall, and that was his favorite activity. He just really liked square dancing. The only thing was, he told Jarvis one day, he said, you know, I'm really afraid that one of these husky country ladies is going to swing me off my feet or crush me. And so I said to Jarvis, yeah, that's funny. And did he really say that? He said, yes, and he was really afraid of that. And that's my brother Joe jumping off the covered bridge. We all used to do that, and the Rockwell kids before us, I bet you people have jumped off that since it was built in 1867. So we had a lot of fun jumping off the bridge, but I think it was one day towards the mid-70s where the constable came by, he lived across the street, and he said, no more jumping. And my brother was up on the bridge, and I was standing next to my mother and the constable, my mother said to the constable, well, how do you want him to get down? He said, jump! But, all right, so the theme of this talk is that Norman used authentic models to make authentic paintings. And he found them he went to many events around town. He told everybody to call me Norman. So when I did this, they told me to call him Norman because nobody called him Rockwell and Mr. Rockwell. So that's why I refer to him as Norman. So he found models at the Grange Hall, the Rotary Club, art shows, square dances, church suppers, athletic events. He went to schools. He sort of had the key to the town, even factories to find models. And he really studied people. His son Jarvis said his father studied people since he was 15. Studied, you know, their physical attributes, emotions. If he meets somebody who really looks spirited like a kid, he knew where to find one. Most of the time, sometimes he really had to search, but a lot of them he had cataloged in his mind or on paper. And he went to great pains to find these models. Sometimes he tried 3 or 4. And the bad thing about that is somebody would model, like a girl named Artis Edgerton who lived next door, and she'd think, I'm going to be in the Saturday Evening Post, maybe tell a couple friends, and the Post would come out and be somebody different, because he didn't call around and tell everybody, you're not in it. You know, I'm sure he didn't have time, or, you know, that wouldn't be fun, so, yes. Okay, so this answers the question. his models were real people, and here are some of them from the gossip. And it's like a movie storyboard where gossip goes through the town like lightning. And the first woman up here got angry at him, and she actually moved away after this painting. But nobody seems to know who she was. She was a real person. And this fellow here was Mr. Harrington. He was a farmer in West Arlington. He had a farm on a hillside, and he was known for using ropes to somehow wrap it around the rows of hay and pull it down to where he could, get the baler in. Let's see. This is a woman here, Rena Crowfoot. I know there's a Crowfoot relative here. I remember meeting her in her 80s because we swam at that red-covered bridge with her grandchildren. And there is Doris Crowfoot, right, who I remember very well, being over at her house with her daughters and some of the other kids. She taught herself how to play the piano. Yes, all by herself. And so, yes, these were all West Arlington people. Norman put himself in. He thought that would, he felt more comfortable by putting himself in because he could be considered a gossip too, and people wouldn't point the finger at him as much. When this lady here got mad, Norman called up Rena Crowfoot and said, "Listen, I'm really worried about this painting I did." And she just laughed and said, "Norman, don't worry about it." He did, for writers and artists and, people in most jobs, but, worry about what other people think of their work. So that was one thing for him as an artist. People always wanted to look good in the paintings, and once in a while they didn't want to be in a painting really, or maybe they didn't like exactly how he portrayed them. Most of the time it went really well. And this is, one of my top favorites, the Marbles Champion. 1939, that was the first painting he did in Vermont. And the model is from right around here, Ruth McLenathan Skelly. Norman came to Cambridge, New York, looking for a girl with red hair and freckles. Red hair, freckles, and brown eyes. Girls with red hair usually have blue eyes. So that I think maybe he heard about her at the Grange, but he came to Cambridge and was walking the streets asking people if they knew this girl, because, like I said, he wanted an authentic model. And finally, somebody said, "Oh, I know her. That's Mr. McLenathan's daughter. He owns the Cambridge livestock auction." And so Norman went over to Shushan and found Ruth at her grandmother's house, pinning clothes on the line. And they, had a little conversation. This artist that Ruth saw looked legitimate, and, her grandmother had no problem with her going to the studio in West Arlington. So Norman took her over there, and she had a big secret that she wanted to tell him, but she told me she couldn't quite get it out. Now, if anybody knows about the history then in the 1930s, marbles was the kids' most popular game, especially in the schoolyards. So that, they all played, but it was mostly all boys, and very few girls played marbles. So anyway, when she got done, or halfway through modeling, Norman was telling her how to pose and all, and she finally said, "I know how to play marbles, and I beat the boys at marbles," because she had learned from her brother. And, that was a great coincidence for the painting. He had, coincidences like that sometimes. So our marbles champion in the painting really was a marbles champion. And Ruth liked to tell the story about her father. I hope I don't get in trouble here. Franklin McLenathan bought all the copies in probably Shushan or Cambridge of the marbles champion. And when he got home, Ruth said to him, "You don't have any copies, you're not carrying anything." And he said, "No, I gave them all out." So he had driven around and given all the copies out. And poor Ruthie didn't have one until a few years later. Her aunt had saved one till she and her brothers and sisters grew up, so nobody would take it. Okay, this is Jarvis Rockwell, at the time of marbles champion, the boy in the red hat. So Ruthie remembered meeting Jarvis and his brother Tom over at the house. And there's Ruth and I. This is probably 3 or 4 years ago. That's her painting, and there's Ruth. She traveled around, this area doing presentations which I'm sure a bunch of you know. She really loved being in that marbles champion and representing Norman Rockwell. It was great fun. And there's Ruth. That's a few years ago in Cambridge. That's the last place she lived. And as many of you know, many I guess better than I, she made these beautiful wedding dresses and graduation dresses. Now this fellow there in the painting, Floyd Bentley, he had a little farm in Sandgate, Vermont, and his brother Charlie is the farmer I worked for in West Arlington. So I knew Floyd very well in breaking home ties, the melancholy fellow there. And he was a horse farmer, a horse trader. He had a few cows, but his cousin Charlie told me in the early 1900s you could get by, just having a few cows and a garden and making a few dollars somehow, because I think the income tax didn't start till 1930. My grandfather was an excavator and dairy farmer, and I remember seeing the first tax form in 1930 where you simply figured out your income. The tax form was half a page, you multiplied your income by 10%, you sent a check to the IRS, and that was it. So Floyd was able to live quite humbly, even through the years when I knew him. He was a melancholy fellow like that. It started in 1929 when his mother and brother died the same year, a week apart. And he was sort of a sensitive guy. People who knew Floyd knew that. And so that really makes the painting authentic. Floyd is the father of a boy who's going to college, leaving home, and as you can see, the father is melancholy about it. Now, at the same time of this painting, Norman Rockwell had become an empty nester too. So he was able to project his feelings into it. He always said that the painting has to have strong feeling in it to grab the reader, so he was an expert at that. And there's Floyd, the fellow on the boy on the horses, Bob Reed, who owned a lumber yard, I think in Brandon, Vermont. And there's Floyd, and in the back is one of those Sandgate barns that's barely able to stand. It's a little bit crooked and everything, but that's where we loaded hay, one of the barns. And Floyd was just a really nice guy. In about 1968, my father said to us boys, when we saw Floyd mowing the side of the road with horses and a sickle bar, he said, "Take a good look, you'll never see this again." So Floyd cut the sides of the roads with horses a few more years, and I haven't seen it again. He really disliked combustion engines. And they used to say about him, by the time Floyd hitches up those horses, he could have been there and back. Now this is one of Norman's most popular paintings. It became a war bond ad in 19 43. Now, I don't know if anybody knew Carl Hess, the gas station owner in West Arlington, but he was there a long time, probably from the late 40s until almost 1980. I first began seeing him at about 10 years old when I was working on Charlie Bentley's farm on the corner of Sandgate Road and 313 in Arlington. There was a barn there, and I used to go over and see Carl and buy sodas and chat a little bit. He would also fix inner tubes and bicycle tires. I don't know if that was a profitable endeavor for him, but he used to do it for everybody. So Norman walked in his gas station and said, "Carl, you have a noble head." And Carl said, "Yeah, but there ain't much brains in it." And Norman probably said, "Yeah, not much in mine either." Oh, and then when my father used to drive in, he would say, "Hi, Carl, how are you?" And Carl would simply say, "About so." And here's Carl, our freedom of speech model, at his gas pump in, the early 50s probably. And there he is. I was able to dig up this picture. To me, collecting pictures of the models is like collecting baseball cards. I'm still trying to get more. There was a couple people here I'm trying to get them from. And so, there's Carl in the middle. I've noticed his forehead was slanted back just a little bit more than most people's. And I think Norman probably noticed that, and it gives a distinct feature. He was always looking for that. If somebody was perfectly beautiful, you probably wouldn't be in a painting, unless it was an ad where they made him put somebody gorgeous with a perfect chin, perfect nose or something. But he didn't like that. That's one thing he liked about being in this area is, people weren't, as he used to say, so prettied up as they are down towards the city. But I do remember it must have been almost like 1980, drive up to Carl's to get gas. He'd be sitting up on the porch, and you'd wait about 5 minutes. But in 1980, he didn't care that much, and especially my father thought that was quaint. We're getting away from the suburbs, and who cares how long it takes him. So this is the West Arlington Grange, and that's where he had the square dances. In the early 70s, I used to dance there too. It was really a lot of fun. And probably I know people went from Salem over there, like Neil Adams, who I think he still has a farm here, and he used to go over, and people from Shushan and like Dorset, Vermont. It was a really big dance. The whole place was crowded, the whole lawn was cars, and it was very popular. And this is Norman's most valuable painting called Saying Grace. It was a cover of the Saturday Evening Post in 1951. Readers voted it their favorite. The woman in the painting, I guess the woman in the painting was May Walker, and she was a member of the Arlington Federated Church. And she was a devout member, and she also liked to do things like canning vegetables and gardening. So he found her, maybe through her husband, who was ran the boiler at Mac Molding, which is still the plastic factory over there. And she, if you can see how she has her hands clasped, she was dying at the time. And she died actually before the painting came out, but Norman invited her over 3 days before she died, and she got to see the painting. And this, the boy with the brown hair is Jarvis Rockwell. He's now 91 years old. And that was him during the Korean War. He was home on leave in 1951. In the front left is where you can just see the front of his face is Gene Pelham, Norman's assistant for 13 years. So, May Walker especially was a very authentic model. She fit that role perfectly, and I'm sure he knew that she was really a praying woman. And on the left is Don Hubert Jr. I believe his brother Charlie Hubert is in a painting called Walking to Church with local models. The adults in it were Ken Godfrey and his wife Charlotte. And the boy in that painting was Charlie Hubert, and that was Don's brother. And there's Don and myself at the Rockwell Museum. You can see the paintings in the background. Now, what Norman liked about Don was his floppy ears. You can see, just like Carl's forehead had tilted just a little more than most people, these ears are just a little more floppy than most kids. And Norman really liked that, and so he chose Don as the model. He met Don at the Arlington School. He went in, and the teacher said, "This is Mr. Rockwell, an artist, and may I have all the kids stand up and do a circle around the room?" And so Norman thought that Don would make a great model for that painting. And Don is still around. He lives in Westchester County, New York. And this is Norman's son, Jarvis. That was in March of this year. He's 91 years young. And if anybody's ever met him and knows anything about him, he's a real fun character. He's got a really good sense of humor. He makes people feel very comfortable. And he grew up in West Arlington as a child. But the thing was, he came to West Arlington from New Rochelle, New York, a city, a fancy city with, marketing people and business executives and actors and all kinds of artists. And then when they moved to that house that was half a mile from the nearest neighbor, it was pretty much a shock to Jarvis. He went to school and there was like 7 kids in the class, and he didn't take to it very well. It took him quite a while to adjust. But through his life, he's been an artist, and at 91 years young, he held up my book. He said he liked it, and that made me feel really good. Okay, so here's the painting Walking to Church. Norman did that in 1953. He found these 2 brownstones, or the brownstone and the store in Troy, New York. And you can see it contrasts a family walking to church, all dressed nice and neat with, a trash-strewn street. Okay, and when I was about 10 years old, my mother took us to a barber. She said, "It's only 50 cents a kid, and I have 6 brothers and a sister." So add up the numbers, that was a lot cheaper. I think in Arlington we're paying like $1.50. So she said, "We're going over to Shushan. There's a gentleman there who cuts people's hair." And it was a few houses away from Ushak's store, if anybody knows that, maybe 3 houses away. And he was a nice man, about 80 years old. He had a barber's chair in the living room and a barber's sign that was red, white, and blue. And, we got our haircuts. I remember he had cats. He had a really nice tabby cat with brown spots, and I can remember it running along the top of the couch behind me. But, through the years I'd drive by and I'd remember, this elderly man who cut our hair, and I'd often think, who was this guy? Never found out until I guess it's Camille Cristaldi contacted me on Facebook with a message. I really enjoy this Facebook stuff. I'm sorry if somebody doesn't like it, but I have fun with it as long as I shut it off like at 10 o'clock so I get a full night's sleep. It's tempting sometimes to stay up, but I'm pretty good at getting off it. So anyway, Camille said, you know, my grandfather was a Rockwell model from Shushan. So I said, well, where did he live and so forth? She said, well, he was a barber there. I said, well, I had a barber in Shushan. I said, you probably wouldn't know him. He was 80 years old when I was a kid. And she said, that was my great-grandfather. And she went on to tell me these wonderful stories. There he is, Albie Roberson with Al Prindle, who I never met, but I've read some about him and watched Tom McMorris's video to learn that he was the postmaster in Shushan. We were always going to Ushak's store to pick up a couple things, and to see our barber. But somebody told me, or I read this, that Norman Rockwell, part of the reason he went to Shushan is he got his haircuts in the early 50s for 25 cents. And Norman didn't have a lot of money then, so I imagine it was a combined trip for business and haircut. And the other thing about these is, back then, and there's still people today, artists and writers and all knew that if you always wrote and did intense stuff, you know, books or art, that you could wear yourself out. So in the early 50s, Norman was kind of worn out. Along with doing that painting, Saying Grace, and starting this painting for the UN, we'll see the drawing. I think his mother and his mother-in-law and father-in-law died like in 1951 and 1952, all three of them. And, you know, his wife wasn't feeling that well. He was really tired. So, you know, I can just picture him saying to himself, I gotta do something fun. And then he was in the Grange in West Arlington, and I bet you somebody said, you know, if you're looking for models, go over to Shushan. So he found these two guys, and, you know, the tired artist had a lot of fun. It's great for him to switch it up like that, and I think that's partly how he lasted so long. You can imagine F. Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Edgar Allan Poe, maybe once in a while they should have said, you know, I'm just going to write a total farce of a comedy, and, you know, they might have had a better fate, because when you're an artist or writer and you're doing totally intense stuff all the time, it's very tiring. So actually for me too, this is a fun project. So there's two old men dancing. In 1921, Norman did a painting called No Swimming. Probably most of you who know Rockwell know this painting. It's one of his most popular early photos. You know, I think a lot of us can remember swimming somewhere where we weren't supposed to be, and, you know, worrying about that somebody's going to find us out and chase us away. So that was very popular. And so was this. You gotta love this one. And that's Albie Roberson again, and Al Prindle, and the dog there, bolting, because I guess they've just been kicked out of a swimming hole and somebody's, you know, going to get them, or they're afraid. And so that's a great one. You gotta love this one. And, you know, Norman had a real sense of humor, and I'm sure he just loved having Al Prindle pose like a guy who's, you know, being taunted for being beaten at checkers, and, you know, like the details, the hair. Sometimes when people try to imitate Norman's work, the biggest mistake that I've seen is they have people looking too good. Norman liked, you know, people to pose with worn shoes, you know, their hair sticking up. You know, it took a lot of time to really get that all right, so it just, you know, looked like regular people. Okay, here is the great drawing of Norman Rockwell. It hangs in the United Nations in New York City, and we have Paul and Pauline Adams here today. They posed for this in 1950 42 in Norman's studio, and most of these are Arlington people. There's Paul right at the center of it, holding this bowl, and it looks like a bunch of people sort of, maybe asking the world for help or kindness. And behind Paul is Mary Whalen, the girl at the mirror. This woman here, Rose Hoyt, who had 10 children, she's holding her son Jimmy there. She's also in Freedom of Speech, the one with Carl Hess, and Freedom of Religion, Freedom of Worship, right in the front with a braid around her hair. And this is Pauline Adams, again, who's here today, right here. And this is Mrs. Adams, Martha Adams. And, again, here is Marie Briggs, who was in the picture with Norman Rockwell when he was sitting on the porch railing. The Arlington saint who, when you went to church, she often, made the baked goods, and she helped out people in the town, just by giving them little jobs and being kind. She was really a great soul. Her picture's up in the west, in the Sandgate Methodist Church. Here's that fellow here from that picture where Norman had the tattered coat and paint all over his pants. So if you were around Norman, you had a good chance of getting into paint. And there's Buddy Edgerton's, Norman's favorite Boy Scout model. And Mary Rockwell is there. And this was a drawing that he intended as a gift to the UN. And you see he has delegates from these countries. Problem was he had the ambassadors, I guess, from Russia, and when he had him pose, he was smiling, a big smile on his face, and Norman needed to get him back if he was going to put him in it to get to sketch and get a picture of him with a serious expression on his face. So he never completed it, but again, this really helped to wear him out in the early 50s, and why he did things like with Al Prindle and Alvy Roberson, because, he was, to do all this, was really complicated. But he was able to recognize that and just back off and do something easier. Okay, so here's Paul and Pauline, the brother Carl, and little sister Mary Beth. That's in 1952. Norman gave Grandma Moses a call. Probably, maybe even somebody here met her as a child. When I was in Cambridge, a couple of people had, had meals with her or visited her and so forth. And Paul and Pauline went over to her house to sing gospel songs. And Paul will tell you she had chinchillas, and he had a great time chasing it around the living room. And so Grandma Moses was a lot of fun. And she recommended the Adams for this painting. He wanted to include, people of other races and so forth in his painting. I think because when he was a kid, he was frail, and his mother really got down on him a bit, even though he couldn't help it, and he was pigeon-toed. And in Mamaroneck, New York, where he went to school, his brother was the captain of the football team. And what a contrast to be really unable to play sports and have a brother who's the best in the town. So, and sometimes his brother's friends picked on him. So he really, when he got successful, he had a lot of compassion for people because he knew what it was like to hurt emotionally. And so, let's see, it was a man named Bill Butler, a cab driver, who went over and picked Paul and Pauline up. And in the book, I talk about how Norman told Paul that if he could stand still while he sketched and did this photo, he had a present for him waiting out in the snow. But yes, that's in the book. And here's a picture of me and Paul and Neil Adams. I know some of you know him, a farmer in Salem here. And that's at the Sandgate Ox Roast. We just all happened to go to the same one up in Sandgate every August, I think the third week. So if you feel like it, come on up to Sandgate. And that would be good. So there's Paul and Pauline again. And this fellow here is Marty Oakland. And he's in a Norman Rockwell Boy Scout painting with young Thomas Rockwell. So here is, as I was saying, Norman was very benevolent, and this is called The Problem We All Live With. In the early 60s, it was a very important civil rights painting. And you can see somebody smashed a tomato on the wall, and these are U.S. Marshals escorting young Ruby Bridges to school. He did several other civil rights paintings. Okay, now, I forgot to bring my poetry book up, but I always give it to the person who can guess what Norman Rockwell model is in paintings in New Rochelle, Stockbridge, and in Vermont. Does anybody venture a guess? Okay, which one? No? Which one? Do you know the name of the other one? His son? Okay, then there's one more. Do you know the name of the other one? Did I? Oh, Tom, close enough. You get I'll give you a free one of my poetry books. Yes, it's Thomas Rockwell. Okay, so in 1936, when Norman was in New Rochelle, he did this painting. And there's young Thomas. He may well have had red hair. Sometimes Norman put red hair on people because it grabbed people's attention. But Tom had reddish hair as a kid, so he might have made it a little redder. This is called Puppy in the Pocket. This is one of the ones where you look at it and it takes you a moment to figure out what's going on, and then you kind of maybe smile and see that pretty soon the boy's going to find a puppy in the other pocket. And probably a lot of us, when we were kids, had an uncle that the kids just loved. But the parents were like, oh my God, he's coming over to visit. And I always tell people I had one like that. And my brothers and I, and Uncle Bob, he took us fishing, and he always had little jokes like, nothing's biting but the mosquitoes. And he made this dough bait to catch carp in the Potomac River, and he was a lot of fun. But then he would do things like, one time at his cabin on the Potomac, he was playing cards with a few people, and this one guy was winning all the money, so he put a siren under the bed and hooked it all up. And when the guy went to bed, they turned on the siren, and the guy practically jumped through the roof. So we loved his stories and all. But my uncle, who was a very proper guy, he used to scowl and say, he was some character. So Mrs. Rockwell didn't really appreciate Uncle Gil, and one year he brought Christmas presents. He got to the Rockwell home before they came home, and he hid him all over the house. Only problem was it was the wrong house. So when both families got home, he had to go back in, and he was really nervous because he couldn't find where he put him. But Norman really loved Uncle Gil. He thought he was great. So young Thomas Rockwell, and there is Tom in high school when he was about 15. This is Jarvis here, coming back at Christmas homecoming. And you can see Norman liked these details. The suitcase is not neat, things are sticking out. Yes, that's Grandma Moses there. Norman and her became good friends. Now it was pretty good to have a friend like Grandma Moses, right? Because in the 40s, she was the most famous artist in America. And I told somebody that she was on the cover of Time magazine. They said, no, it was Look magazine. But I think it was both because I looked up her picture on Time magazine. So she was, known around the world. They asked her to come to Paris. A museum had bought some of her paintings, and they predicted she was going to be very successful. So they said, Anna, Grandma Moses, we'd like you to come to our museum in Paris. And her response was, I can't possibly make it. Who's going to feed the chickens? And that's true. But she also told Norman she would not show him her studio because her studio was in her bedroom and she did not allow a gentleman in there. So he didn't get to see it. And that's Mary Rockwell. This is, as I said, Jarvis and Peter Rockwell and Norman. So Jarvis said this is his favorite painting because his whole family is in it. And there are other things like Mary Emmon Hall, whose father was Bert Emmon, a real estate broker for my family and the Rockwells. And this is Sharon O'Neill. Her father was Dr. O'Neill in Arlington. He was our family doctor. Fortunately, my brothers went, but I never had to go see him, so I'm happy about that. Oh, and there's Rena Crowfoot again, who was also in the Gossips. So, and that was Jarvis's girlfriend. He said he got his first kiss at that red-covered bridge in West Arlington. And there's Grandma Moses. That is at the, and there's the Gossips up on the wall. That's at the Green Mountain Diner in Arlington for her birthday. And I think around that time she went down to Washington to meet with Harry Truman, who was president, and he gave her an award. And also, I don't know if you knew this, I didn't know it till I started doing my research, but Grandma Moses was the inspiration for Granny on the Beverly Hillbillies. And that is true. Okay, here's Thomas Rockwell. I think he was about 26 at the time, but his father used him as a high school graduate anyway. And I don't know if you can see, but if you look more closely, he's graduating from high school in a very difficult time. There was a draft extension. Khrushchev warns of danger with atomic weapons and so forth. So kids back then, thought they were having it really rough graduating. And there is Thomas Rockwell and I in Poughkeepsie, New York. Thomas is now 90 and really had a lot of fun with him. We're looking at an earlier book, maybe 30 years ago, Norman Rockwell's People, that it's a wonderful book. Some of you have probably seen it, a lot of pictures and text. So my book goes into a lot more detail about the models and their lives and friendships with Norman, but that is a terrific book. The other thing about Thomas Rockwell, he wrote a book called How to Eat Fried Worms. Maybe some of you have heard of that. It sold 3 million copies, and I think it was Random House who finally published it. The other publishers said that How to Eat Fried Worms, it sounds kind of gross. The book is a little spirit about these kids who are a little, wild, and, parents won't like it, libraries won't like it. And I think it was Simon & Schuster, but a major publisher said, yes, but the kids will love it. And so it was published, sold 3 million copies. And it was like 3 years ago, Tom told me that he still makes about $15,000 a year from the royalties. And it was a Hollywood movie, How to Eat Fried Worms. Okay, so we've come to the end. My book is also available at Battenkill Books in Cambridge. It's online. I, of course, have some here today that I'd, love to sign. And there again is my Facebook information, and anybody who's on Facebook or wants to get on. I love to get messages from people. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It was a real pleasure.
Before we leave the room, there is one other thing I would like to do. The program today was terrific, and I thank Steve for putting it together, and Tom McMorris for doing all his research and filming, and again for Judy Flagg for doing her research. And Tom, I think you have some material available under your name. McMorris photos, if you. So again, another hand for Steve for his fine presentation. Thank you. That concludes our meeting up here. So we'll see you downstairs.